ride of the season, although it's full, is this coming Saturday now on the Merrimack River. So it's fully booked, but if you know of anybody who still wanted to take the boat ride this summer, they'll have to wait until next summer now. But and then my walking tours are still available. They're on the green flyer on the back of the room. So if you want any information, or you know of anybody who wants information on my walking tours, you can pick up a green flyer. We also have an exhibit in the gallery behind me, which just opened recently. It's a poster exhibit on the women's rights movement worldwide. So if you're interested, before you leave today, we'll open up the doors thereafter, and you can take a look. Some of them are on display here in the community room, okay? And then the rest are in the gallery, which again, before you leave, if you'd like to take a look, all right? And also, as some of you know, next Wednesday, we are celebrating the 35th anniversary of Lawrence Heritage State Park. On September 1st, 1986, Governor Dukakis officially opened Lawrence Heritage State Park. So he will be coming back next Wednesday with his wife Kitty, and to help us celebrate 35 years of serving the public. And we'll have some other dignitaries here as well. And we'll be in the park next door to keep everybody safe. So we'll be outdoors in Visitor Center Park. We'll have a big sheet cake there. We'll cut the cake, and we'll also have a light lunch. So 11:30 next Wednesday. So if any of you are interested in coming, a week from today, to help us celebrate 35 years of educating the public and enriching the public with the history of Lawrence. So you're all welcome to attend. All right. And then also on Labor Day coming up on September 6th, we'll be having the 37th annual Bread and Roses Heritage Festival on the Compagnon Common, 2 blocks up from here. So this is an annual celebration, as some of you know, that celebrates the American worker, basically. Celebrates the American labor movement, the American worker, the rights that American workers have gained throughout the years, a lot of which originated right here in Lawrence in the aftermath of the Great Textile Strike of 1912, more commonly known as the Bread and Roses Strike. Okay, so that's a very important part of history that Lawrence did help facilitate here with the outcome of the Great Textile Strike of 1912. So that's 12 to 6 on Labor Day. There'll be food vendors up there. We'll be having tours and demonstrations. There'll be musical entertainment, the free trolley rides that we normally do on Labor Day, 12 to 4 in front of City Hall. And then I'll be doing the walking tours of downtown Lawrence, 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock. So if any of you are interested in the walking tours or the trolley tours and anything else, again, we hope to see you on Labor Day. All right, so. Okay, so now today for the final brown bag lunch presentation of the current season, one of my colleagues at Northern Essex Community College, Dr. Steve Russell, history professor, has graciously offered to be today's speaker, and he'll be talking about the 14th century plague known as the bubonic plague, the 1918 epidemic or pandemic, and COVID. So it's a very timely topic considering what we've been through over the past couple of years or so. And Steve will offer his perspectives on that, all these epidemics and plagues, which being history, we can learn a lot from that, like everything else from history that occurred in history. So I will now turn this over to Dr. Steve Russell. Steve.
Thanks, Rich, for the invitation and the nice intro, and welcome to all of you here this afternoon. You know, speaking of COVID, this is the first time in 18 months that I've talked before a live audience, which I would do every day. You know, teaching college, and I'm a little out of practice, I think. But you can help me along. Please feel free to interrupt me with questions and so forth. So, you know, researching this business of pandemics throughout the centuries, I think we probably have a big one about every century. Okay, so we have the COVID in the 21st, we've got the 1918-19 influenza of the 20th. There are others, of course, too, but those are the ones that kind of really stick out. And the one, of course, that Rich mentioned that I'm going to talk about quite a bit is the 14th century bubonic plague, which was a big one, but so was the 19 influenza. And by global standards, the one we're going through right now really isn't all that bad, which I guess maybe, hopefully that's comforting to you, but we'll see. But let me just give you a little bit of background. So far with regard to COVID, we have a population globally about 8 million people, right? And so far, as best we can see, about 212 million people have been infected and maybe 4.43 million people have died. Not that bad. Not that bad compared to the influenza epidemic 1918-1919. Global population is about 1.5 billion, which is, I was surprised how low the population was and how much we've grown in the last century. Probably about 500 million cases have appeared and maybe 50 million deaths. Okay, so again, that's pretty serious. About 1/3 of the global population was infected. Going back to the 14th century, we're talking about a population of about 500 million people, and about a third of them, 15 to 40%. That's the estimates, of course, vary wildly as the further back you go. Even with our own COVID-19, the estimates are a little bit uncertain at times. For example, in New York State this morning, it was revealed that Governor Cuomo might have not counted, but about 10,000 people. And I imagine that will be other reports like that coming up. But in any case, here in Lawrence, in the U.S., for example, well, let's start with the U.S. We've had 628,000 deaths from COVID, about 37 million cases. Massachusetts, over 18,000 deaths. Here in Lawrence, as best that I can see, about 254 deaths in a population of about 87,000, probably more. Again, there's always this issue of unreported deaths, okay? And we're getting pretty good at identifying a case and matching it up with the COVID. Whereas in 1918, if you look, they had a little bit of a harder time. Most of the estimates are based on, the increased number of deaths. So, for example, here in Lawrence, there were about 700 more deaths in 1918 than there were in 1917. So they said, well, that must be because of the flu. Okay, and they're probably right. Okay, but it could have been other things too. But that's the best we can do. What happens, of course, is that when you have crowded conditions, we know about that today, right? Where you have a lot of people living together, like in the city of Lawrence, the death rate's going to be pretty high. And this was a red zone. I'm not sure how it's classified just yet. I haven't heard. But it had been for a good part of last year. And so it was in 1918, 1919, where they had, again, crowded conditions then too. Okay. One of the interesting things about, well, all of these three pandemics I'm talking about kind of come at a bad time. But is there any good time for a pandemic to come? There's always some kind of crisis going on, right? But 1918 especially, of course, comes in the middle of World War I. The U.S. is, just getting its involvement up by, summer of 1918. What happens is, of course, a lot of soldiers are in pretty tight quarters. For example, at Fort Devens out in Air, I think they had something like 50,000 people living there. You know, in a relatively, it's a good size area, 50,000. And about 10% of them died from the flu. Okay. Also, you have naval bases in Boston, Charlestown, and South Boston, and so forth. And you had, thousands of people living in tight quarters. Now, one of the problems is, too, that yes, they knew there was a flu, they knew there was a problem, but a lot of the officials didn't want to talk about it. Okay, they said, we're in the middle of a war, we don't want to, let our enemies know that we have a weak spot here. Okay, so they tended not to talk about it too much. And that goes on even into 1919, even after the war. So the war ends in November of 1918, but there's a lot of residual, how shall I say, propaganda, that the propaganda machine doesn't stop. Interestingly, I was reading about Massachusetts' reaction, or what they did, and what politicians talked about with regard to the flu. And Calvin Coolidge took over as governor in January 1919. Now, most of you maybe have heard of Silent Cal. He never said much. Well, he never said much about the flu either. Okay, he kind of kept that quiet, and he was definitely a gung-ho, making sure that the war was on track. Massachusetts was making its contribution. He was lieutenant governor prior to taking over in 1919. So, yeah, he didn't want to talk about it. I guess we've had some of that in the COVID crisis too. We have had, public officials we kind of want to sweep it under the rug, saying it's not that important, or maybe it doesn't even exist. Some can talk about that in the very early days. So a lot of interesting comparisons here. What are you going to do about it? Okay, what are some of the remedies? Well, some of the remedies in 1918 were avoid tight clothing. Okay, I don't know why. Face coverings, definitely. Okay, and you do see a lot of people masking up. Sometimes masking was required, but other things are salt in the nose. Try that. Let's see, what else? Raw onions. You can close all the windows and boil some peppers. Boil a hot red peppers. Okay then. Don't sneeze and cough in public, of course. That they recognize that might be a problem. If you're going to kiss, do it through a handkerchief. So, you also see, a lot of heroic actions too in 1918. People who, for example, they had kind of a tent city here in Lawrence, and there was an exhibit at the Lawrence History Center in 2018 or 19 about the 100th anniversary of the flu, and there were a lot of pictures on their site, and you had a tent city, but people were crowded together. There wasn't the separation. So again, you went there to that. My mother tells a story of what her mother told her. This was in Manchester. She said, well, if you went to one of these places, you weren't going to come back. You went to the hospital. It was kind of to isolate you from the rest of the population. But there wasn't much they could do for you. She said one of the problems, the way my grandmother saw it, is one of the problems was that they had instituted prohibition, and this was the wartime prohibition, not yet the 20th Amendment or 18th Amendment. And so they said that this was a problem because a lot of the remedies, they needed alcohol. They said if you you have that, you're all set. So people, of course, made their own, and supposedly that helped keep them healthy. But one of the things, of course, is that people in the city of Lawrence, they closed churches and social clubs for a short time in the fall of 1918. They had a phase here in Massachusetts. Had a phase in the summer of 18, and then they thought it was gone by August, September or so. But then it came roaring back in September and October, and they had to figure out, what are we going to do about schools? Okay, same as today. What are we going to do? You know, of course they didn't have the remote learning option that we did, but most districts closed for a little while. In the city of Boston, they didn't close at all. They said kids are safer in school. I don't know. They said that until a couple of kids died, and then the flu hit young people a lot harder than I think COVID does today. I think that COVID tends to hit the older people, whereas younger people not so much. Although with the new variant, some of that is changing. And you have you have waves of infection, kind of same as we do right now. But let me turn back a little bit to 1347. Okay, it's not the worst of times for Europe, but it's not a great time either. Europe is in the middle of a 100 Years' War, basically, which starts 1327 and goes to 1453, off and on, mostly between England and France, but they had their allies as well. You also have a situation in the Catholic Church where there's a split, and it's a split between two claims to the papacy. One supported by the French kings, and the Pope was headquartered in Avignon, southern France, and then another supported by the Roman nobility and the Roman families. Their Pope was, of course, headquartered in Rome. So there was tension between the two. So that's another problem. And, you know, in a pandemic, you look to the church for comfort. But if they're all wrapped up in politics, you know, all this kind of other stuff, they tend to be distracted. Again, but there's a lot of people within the church, clergy, monastics, lay people, who really took their faith very seriously and ministered to the sick as best they could. Another crisis that Europe was going in the 14th century through an ecological crisis, partly caused by booming population, which is a good thing. Generally, we look at civilizations and we say, when the population is growing, things are going well. Okay? It means there's enough to eat, right? There's enough resources. The problem is it's very easy in the Middle Ages to use up your resources awfully quickly. Okay? And for example, when you grow a lot of food, if you've got a lot of mouths to feed, and if you've got the land to grow it on, that's great, but you can use up the land very quickly. Okay? Today we have commercial fertilizers to help us out, and you can argue whether it's a good thing or not, but it does increase food production by quite a bit. They didn't have that then. So what's happening in Europe in the 14th century is they've had to import a lot of food. Okay? And they're in good shape to be, they're able to pay for it, because at this point, Europe is growing a lot of wool, and they're creating these great tapestries and stuff like that. And the textile industry is like this town here was at one time. And so they've actually got something that they can make, probably for the first time since the Roman era, that the rest of the world actually wants. Okay, so they can trade that for grain coming from places like Egypt, Syria, and so forth. The problem is, when you buy that grain, it comes over on ships, right? And wherever you have ships filled with grain, you're going to have rats, right? Now, maybe you've got some cats, on board, but not enough, right? So on those rats, there's usually fleas. One of the problems beginning in 1347 that became, I don't think they understood. They understood the rats, but they didn't understand beyond that. There is a bacteria, bacillus, that travels on those fleas, and that can infect them. So I think that people understood that the problem was coming on these ships. And of course, these came a lot from the Middle East, from Egypt, North Africa, and of course, who lives in the Middle East in the 14th century that we could blame? Who do we blame when we get problems that originate in the Middle East? They're Muslims, right? Okay, they don't accept Jesus, they're heathens, whatever, so this is the cause of it, okay? That's one of the reasons. So, whenever we have a pandemic, of course, we look for what is the cause, and it often translates into blame, blaming some group. A lot of blame levied against China for this particular pandemic, and, who knows? They also did talk about, some scholars had said that the pandemic originated in China, but more recent scholarship seems to indicate it's from Central Asia, and they're not exactly sure how. But this is a time when there's a lot of things, because China suffers from the pandemic as well. I don't have as much info about that. But beginning in late 1347, you can follow the progress of the pandemic in Western Europe, and it starts southern Italy, Sicily, and by middle of 1348, it's covered all of Italy into southern France. 1349, it's up in England, and so it basically moves along the trade routes, and it moves pretty rapidly. And estimates are the best ones that we have, that it kills about half of the Western European population. Half. Think about that. If you got it, very few recovered. A few, but not that many. Some people seem to have immunity. We can figure out why. A lot of reasons attributed as to why. Of course, people are going to ask, why does this happen? So, one of the chroniclers, there's many interesting chroniclers. Maybe you've heard of Decameron Tales, Boccaccio. He talks about them and talks about northern Italy. But there's a monk in Paris, John de Vinet, a Carmelite friar. He said, in the month of 1348, after Vespers, when the sun was beginning to set, a big and very bright star appeared above Paris toward the west. It didn't seem to be high in the hemisphere, but rather very near. And then he said, what happens is it seems to break apart this star and send a lot of comet-like bodies into the atmosphere. And he said he wasn't sure that this caused the plague, this brought the plague. But he said a lot of people thought it did. Okay. People looking for answers. He said maybe it's just a presage of the pestilence to come, because what followed very shortly throughout France is that many people died. Swellings appeared suddenly in the armpit and the groin, in many cases both. They were the infallible signs of death. It's called an epidemic by doctors, but nobody ever seen this kind of epidemic before. He said, whereas in many towns, timid priests withdrew, leaving the exercise of their ministry to such of the religious as were more daring. In many places, not 2 out of 20 people remained alive. So high was the mortality at the Hotel Dieu, which is a hospital in Paris. More than 500 dead were carried out daily to the cemeteries, and eventually they said, we can't keep up with it. You know? So people were left sometimes. The plague, it is said, began among the unbelievers into Italy and crossed the Alps to Avignon. Then it spread through Gascony and Spain, village to village, and finally person. So they understood it as contagion, you know. And those who could got away, tried to get away from this. In Germany, he says, not so bad as there. People were concerned about what's going to happen to them after they die. Of course, this is a deeply religious era, the Middle Ages, and of course the Catholic Church encouraged that. Pope Clement said, absolution from any penalty to the dying. Men died the more willingly for this and left many inheritances and temporal goods to churches and monastic orders. So, not so bad for the church in some cases. Some people said that pestilence was caused by infection of the air and waters. Since it wasn't, there was no lack of food supplies at this point. In fact, they were in great abundance. The theory of infected water and air was brought attention to the Jews, and they were suddenly and violently charged with infecting wells and water and corrupting the air. Again, you're looking for scapegoats. Okay, who did this? And Jews were often blamed for whatever problems you saw in society. In Germany and other parts of the world where Jews lived, they were massacred and slaughtered by Christians, and many thousands were burned everywhere indiscriminately. The plague lasted in France for the greater part of 1348 and 1349, then ceased. Well, when it ceased, what happened? Well, after the cessation of the epidemic pestilence, the epidemic, men and women who survived married each other. There was no sterility among the men, but on the contrary, fertility beyond the ordinary. Again, this is not well documented medically, but this is what he saw, Vinet saw. Pregnant women were seen on every side. Many twins were born, and sometimes even 3 children at once. And he said this, and I don't know if I can verify this, but children born after the plague, when they became of age for teeth, had only 20 or 22 instead of the 32. I don't know. He doesn't have an answer for this either. He said, hopefully, that after the plague passed, maybe we can hope for, I don't know, a new generation that is more moral, more upright. But he says, woe is me. The world has not changed for the better, but for the worse by this renewal of population. Men were more avaricious and grasping than before, even though they they already had greater possessions. Nor by the mortality resulting from this terrible plague God inflicted was there peace between kings and lords. You would think the French and the English might have figured out a way to stop the war that they'd already been fighting for 20-something years, but they didn't. They kept going. It didn't matter. Enemies of the King of France and the Church were stronger and wickeder than before and stirred up wars on sea and land. So he said, charity began to cool, and iniquity with ignorance and sin abound. And there's nobody to instruct the children. We might have a problem today, right? There's beginning to be a teacher shortage. A lot of people have left teaching. So there's many things that are similar. But the devastation is pretty intense. Another commentator from Italy, Agnolo di Cura, he says he buried 5 children with his own hands. And he said in the town of Siena, 70,000 population before the pandemic. And he said 36,000 people, 20 years of age or less. 52,000 people in Siena died altogether. So it's about 70% of the population. And needless to say, the reconstruction of the cathedral they were working on stopped. In fact, all of these cathedral building projects that have been going strong in the High Middle Ages, 12th, 13th centuries, all of those came. So you won't see any of these great cathedrals being built after 1350. There's some, other styles going on later on. He said he was Siena. The great pestilence, each person lived according to his own caprice, and everyone tended to seek pleasure in eating and drinking, hunting and fishing. All the money had fallen into the hands of the nouveau riche. Okay, so they weren't, spending money. The people who died left their money to religious institutions, but those who lived were not interested in that. They spent all the money themselves. So, I think we talk a lot about in the COVID pandemic. We talk a lot about how things might not be the same. Are they ever going to be the same as they were before? We found new ways to do our work. Workplaces have changed a lot. Maybe we don't need to have meetings, with people from all over the country gathered together for 2 or 3 days. Maybe we can do it a couple of hours by Zoom and get just as much accomplished. Or maybe we don't have to have, I was talking a few days ago to our Vice President of Administration, and I said, Mike, I hope the day has ended when we have to go running around getting signatures on documents. And he says, yeah, I think it probably has. I don't think we need to do that anymore. We can just send them along electronically, stuff like that. So it was in the 14th century. The workplace changed. The workplace for most people in the 14th century was a farm. Now, I don't know how much folks know about the Middle Ages, but you had a system where lords owned the land and serfs worked it. And there was a system of mutual obligation. The serfs provided the services, the lord provided protection, roughly. This system was kind of falling apart anyway. Okay? But the plague accelerated it very rapidly. Okay? You rapidly switched to a system where wage labor was much more important. You also had vast tracts of land which were ownerless, without anybody there to, the Lord had died, and all the people who worked for him died, or the chief retainers, people in charge. The records of who told what labor to whom, they're gone. Nobody knows where they are. I suspect a lot of people going back to work next month, you're going to find, I don't remember who did this or how we used to do this or where's this paperwork for that. I'm not going to remember, so we're going to start from scratch. We're going to do it different. And so that's what we find in the 14th century. People who lived were able to squat on any land they wanted. And if indeed they could find the Lord would say, I don't care how much you charge, just work this land for me, just to keep it open. Okay? Because land, when it regrows, is really hard to bring back into production. So laborers could, pretty much name their price, which was good for them, not so good for lords. In fact, the lords were so angry about this new situation that in England, they got Parliament to pass legislation to limit, put maximum prices on wages. Maximum wage, not minimum wages, maximum. You shouldn't pay more than 2 shillings for somebody to clear an acre, 1 minute to plow an acre, something like that. They had to do it several times because, Parliament had to do it several times because people ignored these laws. We see a law being passed many times, it's probably being ignored. So, and when, in fact, they did clamp down on maximum wages, what you would see is peasants rebelling, pushing back. Okay. But they needed the work done. So it's kind of, today, there's a lot of upheaval in the workplace. There's a lot of jobs which are going unfilled. Restaurants, for example, are having a really hard time getting people to work in them. You see a lot of places are closed, for 2 or 3 days per week. And you can say, well, some of that was deliberate because of the unplanned benefits and all that sort of thing. But what you see is an upward pressure on wages. How long it's going to last, we don't know. This in particular one did not last because lords eventually were able, the employers were eventually able to exercise enough influence so that the peasant rebellions were suppressed and wages did not increase. If you look at it by 1400, the increase was modest. But you did have worker shortages, and the manorial system, this feudal system that I was talking about, pretty much ends in France and in England. It does continue, you have it in Germany, and of course in Russia it's just getting started. Russia, by the way, pretty much left out of the pandemic. Other areas, Switzerland, isolated areas, especially mountainous areas, Poland kind of mostly left out. And I would say, well, it's because of the cold climate, but Norway lost, that figure was stunning to me. I hadn't heard that one before. I think it's close to 50% of its population. So 60% of Norway, so that's cold. So I don't know. Maybe it's not the cold. Who knows? It's hard to say. One of the interesting things that I learned, I heard it a few years ago, and I haven't really followed up, is that people wanted to know, scientists today wanted to know, what about the people who did not contract the plague, who lived in highly infected areas? What about those 30% in Siena who did not contract the plague? So they were able to dig up some corpses, get some DNA samples. And it may be that there's something in their DNA that is remarkably similar to DNA of people who contracted the HIV virus, but did not get AIDS. A lot of people have it, but they don't develop any symptoms. So there might be a connection there. There's may be something there. I haven't followed up on that. It's something that probably will come to light. So, there are many benefits, I guess, for having a pandemic in the 14th century. Okay. If you live, life will be pretty good. Okay. You can command high wages. There's a lot of unclaimed property around. The feudal system, the old systems that keep people in line are kind of gone. Even priests are demanding higher wages. You don't have so many people watching you. You can kind of party all you want. A lot of wine cellars, I suspect, too, were unattended. But again, a lot of the local institutions collapsed. Local ruling families. What this does, of course, is open the way for the state to gain more power, particularly in England and France. You have an increase of state power, and some of the local institutions collapse or weaken. And the state is all, because of warfare, the state is already, and you see that today too. A lot of people complaining the government's got too much power managing the pandemic and vaccines and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, they have taken some power. Or in the flu epidemic, the state was gaining power because of the war. I don't think it had much to do with the pandemic at that time. One of the things that happens is the environment is better. Remember about a year ago, people were talking about how, the air seems cleaner back in the spring of 2020, when people weren't driving so much. Well, so it was in Europe in the 14th century. One of the big problems in Europe was deforestation. Okay, so people used wood for, not just for building, but also for home fire, cooking and stuff like that. And Europe was really running out of timber. A lot of it was imported from Sweden, Russia, and so forth. And what happens is when you cut the timber on the hillsides, of course, you have erosion that ruins the farmland, and so it's getting pretty messy. But when you have less land under cultivation or less need for firewood, of course, what happens is your forests start to regrow. So that's kind of a good thing. And in France, the state sort of took charge of that and said, this is a good thing, we want to keep those forests growing, especially in the marginal agriculture. So you have an increase of state power and the ability to enforce that. And France has today is still a very robust system of state forests and highly controlled cutting. So, good things. The church has a lot to sort out, I guess. Okay, and you could say that what happens is that you have some new orders developing, monastic orders, mostly tending to the sick, to poor people. So a lot of people taking the Christian charity mission quite seriously, and a lot of people looking in the church and saying, it could have done a better job, especially the hierarchy. The hierarchy was too wrapped up in politics. People at the ground level often, did pretty good work, like I said. And this opens the way for your reformers coming down the line. People like Jan Hus in Bohemia, Czechoslovakia, and later on, of course, who was not terribly successful, was burned at the stake. But Martin Luther in the 16th century, late 15th, early 16th century, is kind of building on this idea that the power of the church needs to be more localized and not being so invested in the hierarchy. Eventually, the schism is straightened out in the church, and the Catholic Church moves on. But it again loses its monopoly on spirituality in Western Europe, and it's not immediate, but in the end, we see that's what's going to happen. But people say, do you think that this pandemic right now is going to see major social change? Along the lines of what we saw in the 14th century. And I don't know. It's hard to say. A lot of people are thinking it should. Questions about equity are rising to the top. Saying maybe we have attend to this. Questions related to race. How is it that we have so many poor people? How is it that are we going to straighten this out, or aren't we? So pandemics, and I certainly one in the 14th century, do result in major social changes. Sometimes not immediately evident. No, you got to look at the one. Here we've got the luxury of several years here to look at this one, 14th century. What population itself in Europe really doesn't start increasing again for another 200 years. Kind of, it goes down, cuts in half by Western Europe, kind of levels off, and starts increasing at about 1560. You see population in England and France starting to grow. And I don't think it recovers its 1347 level until close to 1700 or so. So this is a long-term event. I don't know, COVID, I don't know, will it be that long-term? The implications? I don't know. What do you think? Anybody have any ideas on that? Do we see major changes in our society? You're going to let us know later?
Political change.
Political change, maybe? Yeah. Maybe. Any specific? So, I think that's. If anybody has any questions?
If anybody would like to ask any questions now?
Comments?
Comments?
I think the government is adding to the problem of the workforce by giving them so much money. And I think there are really people out there that certainly need it, but then I think there are so many others who decide.
With the extended unemployment benefits, yeah. Yeah, the question was, is the government adding to the problem, extended unemployment benefits? There are some states that cut off those extended benefits earlier, and I'm not sure that they have alleviated the worker shortage. The worker shortage is alleviated in those states. So it may be that people are making the decisions not to go back to work based on other factors. You know, like childcare. I think that's a big one. You know, who's going to take care of the kids? And people have kind of gotten used to saying, look at, I see the benefit of maybe being with my younger children over the past 18 months, and I want to continue that. Or maybe it's not worth it to and again, the unemployment benefits probably have some influence, I'm sure. I mean, what you see, it's almost, I don't know if people in the Biden administration are doing this, but they're using this as an opportunity to exert some upward pressure on wages at the lower end of the, it's almost, you know, maybe they're reading about this, I don't know. If I was there, I guess I would do that. I'd say, you know, this is an opportunity to lift those, because minimum wage can't, you know, you can't get those passed, or living wage legislation is really hard to get passed in Congress. So this is another way of doing it. I don't know. You know, we're going to pay more to go out to eat, you know, and I guess maybe that's okay. We could have another lecture on how this is a economy wedded to low wage, you know, which is so dependent on low wage labor. That's another lecture.
Steve, yeah, so you know how things tend to go in cycles, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Like, you know, there's the 20-year presidential curse, for example.
Yeah.
So, and then with the pandemics, you know, every 100 years or so, generally.
Yeah.
So, I know none of us have a crystal ball, but so should we expect like the next big event in 2120 now?
I don't know. My 1 per century one is not entirely correct, because there were some, for example, the SARS, which happened in the, what was that, the 90s or the early 2000s. And we didn't hear that much about it because Ebola,
Yeah.
mostly in Africa. And apparently enough measures were taken so that it didn't spread to the U.S. Will we have some? I think we're probably going to have more because the rate of global exchange continues to increase, and it's very hard to put a lid on that. You know, people moving around. So I think I think the cycles happen, but they happen faster and faster all the time. You know, but I hope not. Or maybe we'll figure out ways to prevent these kinds of things. And that's even back to the 14th century. People began to understand how these things work a whole lot better than they did before. Every time you have one of these, there's some learning that takes place. You know, they learned about quarantine. You know, they learned that it didn't matter what the stars did. You know, or they learned something that that maybe the red peppers didn't work all that well. In 1918. I don't know. You know, I don't know if we learned all that much. I mean, it was probably part of because there was no vaccine coming out of that. There's a flu. You know, and it took us until the 1990s or so before we started to have flu shots, maybe a little earlier. But I guess we probably addressed, certainly worked on that problem quite a bit. One of the things that gets 1918 is really messed up because of World War I. The world is definitely preoccupied with that, and they kind of put everything in that bucket, and so the influenza gets very little attention by historians. I mean, you open up a history book, maybe now it'll be different, but what do they got, a paragraph or so about it? And you got a whole 2 chapters about World War I. But the pandemic killed a whole lot more people, you know? And again, the data collection, of course, is a lot better. We do a lot more data collection. And, sometimes you say that's too much government involvement and all this kind of stuff. But it can help save people's lives. If that's what's important. I guess we're going to do that.
And I thought I read somewhere before that the bubonic plague, that they actually did not develop an antidote for it until the 1940s.
I think that's
I
right.
believe. I think I read somewhere.
Yeah. You don't start to see antidotes coming until, the science of microbiology really gets going, and that's in the 20th century. Smallpox, you have the vaccination. That comes in the 17th or 18th century. In the Middle East, they were doing that, Turkey and so forth. That one they understood, but that one was kind of easy to see, I guess. I don't know, because it had to do with being with. If you were with cattle, you had a better chance of developing immunity to smallpox, which is why the Native American population in the world here, they didn't have that immunity because they didn't have cattle. So smallpox, a lot of people in Europe and Africa contracted it, but not as, it was devastating. That's another huge pandemic which spreads out over several centuries. We'll talk about that too. But another time.
Sure.
So,
Good. Any other questions or comments?
The smallpox vaccinations, were they required that everybody have to have one of those?
I don't know. I think they are in the 20th century. I think kids, for example, had to have a smallpox vaccine to go to school. I suppose they still are. I don't know. They used to get a little thing on your arm. I don't know if that's the way it still works.
Was required.
I don't know about required vaccinations.